welcome to this session called Getting Soils in Shape, Putting Soils at the Heart of UK Farming Policy. Very gratifying to see so many people have signed up for this session, and you're very welcome. My name's Gareth Morgan. I'm Head of Farming and Land Use Policy at the Soil Association. And I've got a stellar panel alongside me today with a lot of really interesting presentations, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. And it's great to have quite so many people who've signed up for this session. I think it shows what a huge amount of interest there is in this topic. I'm also pleased that we've got a short opening recorded presentation from the Defra Minister for Soils, which we'll play shortly. And then we're going to hear from three farmers with a particular interest in soils and who've been innovating in the way that they manage their soils, both from organic and conventional backgrounds. And then three speakers from key NGOs active in this sphere, a colleague of mine from the Soil Association, and also speakers from WWF and the Sustainable Soils Alliance. So the resurgence of interest in soils is particularly encouraging at the moment. It's obviously something that the founders of the organisation I work for, and the clue is in the title, regarded as pivotal to the future of farming and food. And yet I think perhaps soils went out of fashion for many decades, but they're definitely back up the agenda now. And not only in the organic movement, but much more widely, this interest in regenerative farming, agroecological farming, and so on. As I think there's now a recognition that soils are absolutely fundamental to this. Although the session we've got today is UK-wide in its scope, indeed global in its scope, we may well have people listening to the session from around the world. There's a particular moment of importance in England because there is now a commitment to have a soils health action plan for England, which will be the Minister will outline in her presentation. So there's a particularly important moment at the moment to influence soils policy in England. But the discussion itself will be quite general. And I'm pleased that we have a few colleagues from Defra involved in the development of that shape, as we're going to get to know it, in the audience today. And they'll be very keen to hear your thoughts about what needs to be in this Soils Health Action Plan. And if there are particular questions for them, we'll make sure that they get through to our colleagues in Defra, but they're primarily here in listening mode. And we've made some slight adjustments to the session, partly because we've got such a lot of attendees today. We were hoping to have breakout groups at the end, but that's not going to be possible because of the numbers. So at the end, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So the chat function will be operating, so do please use that as the session proceeds. If you want to flag a question to raise for the panel, if you could put that into the Q&A, and there's also the opportunity to upvote those questions. So we'll take some of those questions that have been upvoted most by the participants, and we'll put some of those to the panel at the end of the session. We'll also be running the Mentimeter, and after some of the sessions, we'll be posing questions. So the Mentimeter, if you haven't already got the Mentimeter app, then the code for that will be appearing, and each of the questions will have its own unique reference code. So if you put that into the Mentimeter app, when the questions come up, we can just take the temperature from attendees on some of the topics that are going to be covered here today. So without any further ado, we'll move on, first of all, to hear the short presentation from Rebecca Pow, who's Environment Minister at Defra, and who has a particular oversight of soils issues. So I'll hand over and we'll hear that presentation from Rebecca Pow first, and then we'll move to hear more from the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be opening this very important session on soil health. Now, this is a subject close to my heart. having grown up on a mixed family farm, also being a very keen gardener, and having held the first ever debate on soil in Parliament. And as Minister for the Environment, I want soil protection and soil health to be given their rightful place at the top of the agenda where land in England is concerned. And now I've actually been fortunate in attending some excellent events over the last year that have put soil very much at their centre. One was the Groundswell event that I attended in person, which was a really inspirational event. And then I also attended the Save Our Soil conference, which was another equally good, but that was a remote conference. And really, it's events like this that bring together people with knowledge, with expertise, and passion. And what we learn from these events is genuinely helping us to inform our opportunities and work out solutions for protecting and improving the health of our soils. Now, we know that soil is a rich ecosystem and is one of our greatest natural assets. The economy, the environment, and wider society all benefit when soil functions effectively. Benefits such as increased biodiversity, flood mitigation, carbon storage, and of course, food production. And I've said before that soil is the stuff of life, and it's obviously a no-brainer that all farmers know how important it is to get this right. And enhancing the natural health and fertilities of our soils is one of the most important things that we can do to make our farming more economically and environmentally sustainable. A healthy soil, which functions effectively, is also more adaptable and resilient to the extreme weather variability that we're experiencing increasingly with climate change. And increasing soil organic matter content and improving soil structure ensures soils provide these vital ecosystem functions. Soil types in England also vary widely, and different land uses and local climates mean that our soils can give us diverse habitats and agricultural opportunities. But this in turn presents a challenge when it comes to designing a policy that can maximise soil health benefits across the country. Clear direction and a coherent plan is needed to address this challenge. And last autumn, the government announced its intention to develop a soil health action plan for England. We will set out the framework and currently plan to consult on this in the spring with the intention of publishing the plan in 2023. The action plan, known as SHAPE, will set out how we will achieve the balance between mitigating climate change, reversing biodiversity loss, and improving productivity. And it will focus on actions in three key areas: to prevent soil degradation and erosion, protect soil by building in resilience and adaptation management, and improve soil health through monitoring and mapping to ensure soil is effectively managed. Supporting responsible land management is a key action with SHAPE. It will look at how land management practices and planning can be adapted so farmers are thinking more about their soil at the early stages of land management planning. This will not only protect soil from the impacts of climate change, but it will also help the soil to remain fertile. We want to help land managers and farmers track the health of their soil and the impact of their management practices over time. We therefore intend to develop a soil indicator, or a healthy soil indicator, soil structure monitoring methodology, and a soil health monitoring scheme. The outcomes of these measures will provide essential baseline data, which will inform future policy development and enable us to consider potential future soil health targets. SHAPE will link us with a range of incentive schemes, such as our future environmental land management schemes, including the Sustainable Farming Incentive and Local Nature Recovery. These schemes are key to supporting sustainable approaches to farm husbandry that will deliver for the environment, improve soil health, biodiversity, and support farm productivity. we are focusing on soil in 2 of the first standards to be rolled out under the Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme later this year, the Improved Grassland Soil Standard and the Arable and Horticultural Soil Standard. Recently published details on the Sustainable Farming Incentive set out what sustainable farming actions farmers will be rewarded for to improve soil health. For example, through encouraging practices such as the introduction of herbal lays and the use of grass legume mixes and cover crops. These are actions that build levels of soil organic matter and avoid compacting wet soil. I know there is the potential for a nature-based carbon credit system to provide farmers and land managers with a financial return for delivering ecosystem services through land management activities for carbon sequestration and storage. And we're looking at how appropriate soil management actions can support carbon storage and wider soil health benefits. SHAPE will complement the England peat and the England tree action plans published last year. It will support the government's ambitions for net zero, for levelling up, building back greener and improving productivity. It will outline how soil health improvements can help deliver against our wider environmental targets, including our historic 2030 target to halt the decline of species abundance. We welcome your thoughts on the development of SHAPE and we'll be inviting comments on our framework when we consult with stakeholders this spring. So thank you once again for inviting me to open this session. I wish you all a very constructive and fruitful debate and discussion today. Look forward to hearing some of the views and thoughts back, and I really do hope that you all enjoy the rest of the day.
Great. Well, we're very grateful to the Minister for giving us that presentation, and it's really good to know that the Soil Health Action Plan is now properly underway in England, and I'm hoping that some of the thinking that we're doing here today will be fed into that. Two things that immediately come out for me from that presentation are the reminder that the complexity of soil, I think, has sometimes prevented action. So we still don't have an agreed soil target in England, because the complexity in the science is often used, I think, to excuse a lack of action. And I think we've got to move beyond that. And also the really challenging aspect around soil, I think, is that they're very geographically specific. And so what really matters is what happens in fields, and yet soil policy needs that broad national context. And so finding the balance between adapting to what needs to happen in particular places and creating a national framework, I think, is one of the key challenges that we're going to be facing. So what I'd like to do now is to hear from some of the farmer presenters who are going to talk about their experience of soil conservation. And our first presenter is James Alexander, who I'll hand over to now.
Thank you, Gareth. So yes, my name is James Alexander. I'm from Prime West Limited. We contract farm, both conventionally and organically in the Cotswolds, and contract farm over quite a wide area. This is actually the only slide and picture you're going to get from me today. I think it's quite apt. It's taken quite a few years ago, but it shows you what soil is like and what it could be like out of the same field. I used to ask, and I would today if we were all in person, for a show of hands of what comes out of the field and what comes out of the hedge, and it's quite surprising how many people get it wrong. As you look at the picture, it's actually the soil on the left is actually out of the field that's farmed, and the bit on the right is out of the grass margin. Now, it should actually all look the same, we all know that, but some intensive farming and not being maybe so careful with soils over the years has led to a lot of soils in fields degrading. But we can make it better, and we can improve it and get it back to how nature intends it to be. Gareth and the guys have asked me today to sort of talk about what's the new thinking and what we've been using in managing soils. But actually, when I sat down and thought about it, there isn't, I wouldn't say, that much new thinking. Because actually, if you go and talk to your grandparents, that used to farm, that things are just coming back round in a circle. We do less to the soil. Soils improve. We grow more different crops. We grow herbal lays, we grow grass, we bring back livestock. It all helps the soil. And which is what farms used to be. They used to be mixed farms growing grass and crops. And it's starting to happen again now. So there is new thinking. There's new ways of improving the soil that we've learned. There's new technologies in machinery, new technologies in, dare I say it, chemicals. Maybe not using so many, but maybe adding in some other beneficial things. We use molasses quite a lot on a lot of our conventional farms. And with soil management, it's learning, and it's what Rebecca Powell alluded to just now, and Gareth brought out from that message. It's what actually works for you in your farm, on your fields. And I think this is something that if you ask farmers what we need from the government is actually the flexibility and the independence almost to do what's right for us, not necessarily for a national framework. That would be my biggest thing, really. Yes, the government can sit down in London and write a paper and write a framework that we should all work to. I think we all know we need to work towards it. But it's as long as they give us the flexibility to do what works for us and helps our farms. So yeah, really, my approach really is that look at what we used to do and bring back some of the older things and do what works for you on your farm. So yeah, that would be my message really today.
Great, James, thank you very much for that, and thank you for your powerful slide, which a picture sometimes worth 1,000 words. I think it tells you
that was my intention.
An awful lot. And thank you for your initial thoughts about what you as a farmer need to see in the shape, and clearly that issue of how we combine the national framework with the local is going to be key. But I've also seen stuff already in the chat saying there are clear things going on in the farmed environment that need to stop. I mean, for example, maize on slopes and so on. So we're going to need to find this balance of incentive and regulation and flexibility in this new shape to make sense of all of that. Let's move on now to our next farmer, Sophie Alexander, no relation, who is an organic farmer, who will be sharing her thoughts and some of the innovative work she's been involved in. And also she's part of the Innovative Farmers Network, and I think the link to that has just been put in the chat as well. So Sophie, I'll hand over to you to talk about your soil experiences.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Well, I can say that learning how to manage the soils at Hemsworth has been a voyage of discovery. The farm is 500 hectares. It's on grade 3 soils. They're complex soils. They're about 5 different landis types. And we have high pH, 6.5 to 8.5. So this tends to lock up nutrients. Could I have the next slide, please? Our soil organic results range from 3.5 to 7.5. We recently changed to the Dumas method. It was a bit dispiriting because it meant that our organic matter readings came down. But I'm reliably informed that it's essential to use the Dumas method rather than loss of ignition on high pH soils. So this is just a typical example of how variable everything is and how hard it is to standardize the metrics for soils. Our crop rotation is 3 or 4 years in herbal lays for all the well-documented benefits that they give. And then we grow about 3 years of cereal crops. I say about 3 years because, as with everything, you still seldom get to the end of the rotation you design. There's always a new idea or something else you want to try, depending on conditions. So another variable. When I started at Hemsworth in 2011, I was told it would take 15 years to restore the hard-used, exploited soils. Hungry was an understatement. In an organic system, there's nowhere to hide. There are no quick fixes. You fold or you thrive by the health of your soil. As of course the entire world does, as Rebecca Powers said, and it's just that we seem to sometimes forget the reality of that fact. Gareth said soil went out of fashion. Isn't it amazing that something as critical and fundamental to life can go out of fashion? Next slide, please. It's rare to have the right knowledge and enough funds to be available at exactly the right time at the start. Solutions evolve, they don't just arrive, and lots of trial and error is expended in the process. Soil biology was how we needed to look at kick-starting the whole ecological engine again at Hemsworth. And so enter compost tea. This was in about 2015. And the highlight of these trials was with the innovative farmers. It allowed us to explore, make mistakes, and learn a lot. We were working with the Organic Research Centre, who designed the protocols and gave some scientific rigor, and the Soil Biolab, who sampled, did the analysis. There's really not enough time to go into all the detail now, but suffice to say that there were some results on bushel weights and also the disease suppressing potential of compost teas. And those were promising lines of inquiry. Could I have another slide, please? But for me, once I could make enough compost on the farm, I decided that that was the way to go. So making hundreds of tons of compost to directly apply to the fields rather than a few hundred kilos, which was all I needed for brewing. It was very helpful at the time, but compost suits me better. Soil tests have been a bit of a battle. Could I have the next slide, please? NPK is woefully inadequate to assess organic soils or to help us find solutions from those results, because NPK is just predicated on buying artificial inputs. But I have to say, at least our newfound obsession with carbon capture in soils means that you're no longer just a rather odd, demanding and tricky customer if you want soil organic matter and soil biology analysis. They do still add expense to your soil testing, but hopefully they'll become standard very soon. Next slide, please. After 10 years, the biggest game changer to kickstarting the ecological engine has been the integration of our own livestock into the arable rotation. This is in partnership with Oliver Chedji and the Roaming Dairy. They started milking at Hemsworth in spring 2021. The herd are block spring calving. They're milked once a day and out 24/7. The breed is Viking Red, selected for their hybrid vigor and high health traits. Could I have the next slide, please? Skilled grazing management is absolutely key. Not all mob grazing systems are equal. This is the herd of 300 cows being outwintered. This was just a couple of days ago. It was very wet. You can see the ground they've traveled over is still in relatively good order. And one of the secrets of this is they're moved twice a day. We work with a really knowledgeable, experienced herd manager. And in the year that he's been moving and looking after these animals, we have found the nutrient lockup and the microbiology and worm counts. They've improved markedly just in this short time. as he reminds me, he says, cows are good indicators as well as improvers of soil health. Next slide, please. You can see in this how our depleted, hungry soils respond when the cows have been over it. This is a young crop of spring barley, and they've got the fertility nitrogen bumps of lush barley growth at various intervals where the cow muck has been. So eventually our whole farm will be able to respond like this. Next slide, please. Well-managed soils deliver so many vital ecological services. It's definitely not only about carbon, but it's really constructive that the discussion around carbon capture has brought soils into such urgent and sharp focus. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. Really interesting presentation. And I've fallen in love with your Viking cows, which I have to say were new to me, and they look absolutely gorgeous.
Well, you've got very good taste, Gareth.
Right. An interesting message there also about mixed farming as well, and how livestock need to be integrated. So we've got our first question through the Mentimeter. We were interested to know your thoughts about how we communicate some of this to consumers, and perhaps there's a tension here between new carbon labels that are coming in and labels which talk about methods of production such as organic or agroecological or whatever. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts about what you as consumers need to see on labels to help you connect to the farmers who are making decisions about how they undertake their management for soil. So if anyone's got any thoughts on that, if you go to menti.com and use the code there, we can have a look at what the view of the audience is around there. There's interesting results coming in already on that. I don't know, Sophie, whether you've got any thoughts about how you market your products and how you communicate with consumers about what you're doing with soils and communicating the sort of farming methods that you've got.
Well, Gareth, I don't market anything direct to customers. I so applaud anyone that's doing that. I'm not there yet. I supply oats to a company that is becoming increasingly aware and taking action on monitoring its carbon footprint, and also the carbon footprint of farmers who supply them. So I think it is going to filter down as a requirement whether you market directly to the public or through an intermediary. I think labeling is incredibly confusing. And I think there's a real danger of adding just more and more layers of information without streamlining it. I think it needs to be redesigned completely. Incorporate as much information, but just not add another layer of not having UK, red tractor, low carbon, low fat.
And that gives me an opportunity for a quick plug, of course, of organic labelling, which communicates a lot about the soil management that farmers are undertaking. So there are some good labels out there already, food production marks, which communicate quite a lot. But I think you're right, there's this proliferation at the moment of labelling, which can end up very confusing for consumers, and carbon labelling doesn't seem to get a lot of votes here, which is interesting, because one might expect people to be saying it'd be really useful to have single issue carbon labels, but perhaps people are aware of some of the complications and complexities of that, and are looking to get more sophisticated information packaged up and the labels on their food around system of production. So interesting to see that result there. Sophie, thank you very much for telling us about your experimentation and innovation on the farm there. Really interesting presentation. Thank you. We're going to go on now to our third farmer, Adrian Steele, who's an organic farmer and a colleague of mine at the Soil Association, who has been part of the Defra networks in the evolution of the sustainable farming incentive as part of the ELMS schemes. So Adrian, I'll hand over to you, and we'd like to hear about your experiences with soil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Yes, I farm in the Vale of Evesham, and we're quite lucky in the Vale of Evesham in Worcestershire generally. There's some really good, interesting soil maps of the region, and it demonstrates the extraordinary range of soil types that there can be in a relatively short, relatively small geographical space. And I'm also very fortunate to have old maps of our farm over the last 100 years, which demonstrate that soil use and land use is also dictated not just by the skill of the farmer, but also by policy drivers and by economic circumstance. So when I look at maps from the 1920s and 30s, the unsupported period of farming, and I can see a wider range of land use, but quite a lot of that is abandonment. And then when I look into my grandfather's activities in the Second World War, a lot of the work that he did has led to us having fields with names like Holland's Gorse or Meakin's Wood, without any gorse and without any wood. So the big clearances and field drainage that took place in the post-war period transformed the nature of our farm, with the investment that went into that from public policy, and again on our heavy land in particular around field drainage, transformed the type of farming that we were able to use on the farm itself. So I think that we are now at a pivotal time again with agricultural policy, and I have a lot of questions around how that policy is going to relate to my future land use on my farm. What am I going to do with my heavy clay soils? I think that to go back to Sophie's presentation, which was really excellent, in the drive for increased volumes of outputs in the 1970s and 80s, we actually got rid of all our livestock on our farm and went to continuous cereal production using minimum till systems. And we ended up in a terrible mess with herbicide-resistant blackgrass, and had to rapidly rethink the way we dealt with our heavy soils, in particular the heavy clays, and brought back animals into our system. We bought sheep, we bought young stock cattle. Our land's too heavy for adult cattle to take, and introduced began to introduce an organic farming system in the late 1980s, and we've been farming organically ever since then. And we have recognised the dramatic difference that it makes, having livestock, having lays, short-term lays, 2 to 3 years on heavy clay, to sustain organic soil organic matter, to allow for the land to recoup, recover, and then to be productive for a couple of years of cereal production. But the other interesting thing about it, and about the opportunities that we have now, and having listened to Henry Dimbleby on a couple of occasions now around national food strategy and wider perspective around the opportunities we have for agriculture, is that when my grandfather was farming in a very entrepreneurial fashion, the different soil types that we had, where he was able to grow vegetables, he had mushroom production, had small orchards, feeding into a very live, vibrant economic ecosystem of small processors, pack houses in the Vale of Evesham, which meant that the opportunities to appropriately use the land for the appropriate marketplace was there. That went. We don't have that opportunity in the Vale of Evesham that we did have, owing to, in a sense, the pushing of the buttons of economies of scale, specialisation, and category management by supermarkets, which devastated the small vegetable production that was going on in the Vale of Evesham over that time. And I do think that we have, when we talk about soils, we talk about opportunities to change farming, we have to look at the food system as well. And the internet now has given us the opportunity for farms to be more entrepreneurial. But I think that soil policy has to be also taken into account with this wider picture. And certainly those are questions that are going through my mind now around the opportunities for my heavy clay in particular, as to what to do with that. I think the issues around carbon, around biodiversity, are also very, very relevant in relation to perhaps introducing trees, and agroforestry onto the farm to look at other ways of diversifying and increasing biodiversity while still respecting the different soil types that I have. I think that when we talk about economies of scale, this might have to go into a different way of thinking around whole farm systems in relation to farmers working together and cooperating a bit more around machinery. One of the big problems you have on a farm is that you tend to go for one standardized system of cultivation and production because you can only afford one system. You can't have all the different tools you might need for all the different types of fields that you've got. And so I think that we may have to look at more machinery rings, more sharing, more maybe livestock coming on and off farms. Obviously, this doesn't apply to big estates. This is more to more smaller agricultural units. And a greater degree of entrepreneurship is going to have to come back. I'm pleased to say that I see a lot of that in the organic sector, and obviously the Oxford Real Farming Conference is full of entrepreneurial thinkers, people with fresh ideas, and it's always great to be part of this conference. In terms of the SFI and the soil policy that we have now, obviously we're welcoming the direction of travel. We'd like to see more target setting, so it's great to see that being mentioned. But I think that unless we look at all in the round, we are going to have difficulties with the economic viability of farms if we do go down to decreasing scale, increasing complexity, delivering wider set of metrics, and yet the supermarkets are simply importing on basis of price and really not much else. So I think that we do have to respect that this is going to be part of a wider transition. There's a lot of anxiety at the moment amongst farmers, myself included, around the short-term financial prospects. But at the same time, I think we have to remain optimistic about the possibilities. And as long as soil remains at the heart of policy and the heart of the government thinking around the environmental land management schemes, that's a fantastic bedrock and foundation for future policy. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Adrian. And just briefly, as an organic farmer, how will the sustainable farming incentive work for you at the moment? What do you see in it, and what needs to happen and change?
I think what we're seeing is a huge amount of talk around adopting essentially organic practices, but not much recognition of whole farm systems. And I think that's been frustrating from the point of view, from the perspective of the Soil Association and as of being an organic farmer. But I do feel that if we're talking about a policy direction, which is leading towards restoring soil health, restoring biodiversity, then I don't think I have much to fear as an organic farmer. And we just got to keep putting our message across to government that we are part of the solution, and we're not some kind of angry, lobbying group that just sort of fighting our corner, which we're often sort of characterized as having been in the past. And I think we do have to be, consensual. We have to make our points well, but we do need to be constructive and to engage in this because it's potentially a really, really good direction of travel.
I haven't had time to catch up completely on George Eustace's speech yesterday, but there seemed to be a lot of the right language about farm systems and about soil health, but it doesn't seem to be manifesting yet in terms of a really sort of holistic way of looking at farming, and equally the focus on taking land out of production to do good things for carbon, when we've got farming systems that can do good things for carbon in situ as well. There seems to still be a bit of a disconnect, doesn't there?
Yeah, so the indivisibility of animal, soil, plant and health, which is very much one of the 4 principles of IFOAM, needs to be thought through more carefully in relation to policy. I think that there's an element for George Eustace clinging to silver bullets a little bit, tech solutions where really, if you look at just the natural connectivity of soil health, animals and humans, and not look at silver bullets, which are actually in a way divorcing humans from the natural systems and microbiomes. I think that's the only area where I'd feel slightly anxious about George Eustace's approach. Otherwise, I feel that he has got some good things to say.
And interesting that the sustainable farming incentive is getting some thumbs up there, which is interesting. That question slightly biased to our English audience, probably, because then they might be more familiar with it at this stage. But it's interesting that it started with a focus on soils, which perhaps isn't where we expected it to go. and at the minute, and we have had signals that organic systems will be recognised later in the process, at least.
Yes, there are
we'll
going
build
to be
on
a series of 12, at least 12 standards now, and with integrated pest management, nutrient budgeting, biodiversity, agroforestry, they will be coming in with a sort of an organic standard coming in 2025. At the moment, organic farmers are obviously still rewarded through legacy EU schemes, but don't get me started on the EU and the way they're leading with organics, because obviously they're going to be our big competitors. And I think that is frustrating. We're not keeping an eye on that. I think particularly difficult for farmers in Northern Ireland. So I think that's an area where, again, you could see in the European Union a clearer identification of organic farming as being part of this practical solution to the crises that we're facing now around climate change and biodiversity loss.
Yeah. So last chance to get your votes in on the Menti poll there, but I think the Defra colleagues who are watching the session today will be quite encouraged with that endorsement for the way that the sustainable farming incentive has got off the ground in terms of soils. That's interesting to see. Great, thank you very much, Adrian, for your for sharing your experiences there. And I was interested in your point about the importance of lays. It reminded me when I inherited my allotment, my best ever year, I have to confess, was the first year. It looked like an abandoned, tumble down plot, but it was the most amazing organic matter in it. And the battle for me has been maintaining that over the years once it goes into production. And that's what getting the right farming system in place is all about, isn't it? Actually, I'm not viewing that as a one-off benefit, but building that organic matter back into the soil year after year, and avoiding the shortcuts of nitrate fertilizers, which is obviously the crutch that we tend to reach for, but defeats the object. Great, thank you very much, Adrian. So that concludes the presentation from our farmers and practitioners, which were really fascinating. Thank you. And we're now going to move on to a slightly more policy-focused section of the discussion. To set the scene for that, I will hand over to Matthew Orman from the Sustainable Soils Alliance, who's helped us create the session here today. The Sustainable Soils Alliance brings together a wide spectrum of groups and farmers interested in soils and soil health. And Matt is going to talk about some of the wider policy context around soils in his presentation now.
Great, thanks, Gareth. Hi, my name is Matthew Orman. I'm a director of the Sustainable Soils Alliance. We are a campaigning organisation that lobbies for policies that would achieve the goal of sustainably managed soils within the space of a generation. So as you can imagine, we're delighted by the prospect of a soil health action plan for England. And in a moment, I'll share a few top-line recommendations about what we'd like to see included in the plan, many of which actually echo what Rebecca Powell said earlier, which is very encouraging. But first, I thought I'd share a little bit of context behind the recommendations. As this slide shows, 2021 was the year that soils entered the public conversation with Netflix documentaries, government ministers, musicians, Hollywood celebrities, and of course, Jeremy Clarkson, all espousing soils' environmental, cultural, and even lifestyle importance. We could easily argue that soil is now mainstream, soil is now cool, and according to one headline, soil is even sexy. And soil is also valuable. Another recent development is the emerging opportunity to farmers to make money from improving the quality of their soil. And there are three drivers of this. First of all, the sustainable farming incentive due to be rolled out later this year, under which farmers will be paid for improving their soils in line with the two soil standards, arable and horticulture and grassland. Then there's the emerging farm soil carbon marketplace, which promises income to farmers for the carbon they sequester into their soils and the ecosystem services that this delivers, something Liz will explain more about later. And then finally, there is the regenerative farming movement, the catch-all brand for soil-focused agriculture, and one which is paving the way for businesses to reward their suppliers through support, through compensation and premiums, something I know Callum is going to talk about in due course. So what does this explosion of interest and potentially income mean for soil and the farmers that manage it? Well, on the one hand, it's very welcome. soils are finally getting the attention they deserve and increasingly sit alongside air, water, and biodiversity as a critical indicator of the condition of our environment. However, this newfound enthusiasm does come at a cost. All of these stakeholders bring to the table their own expectations of soil, and with them a license to comment, to measure, and even to interfere in what was once a farmer's sole domain, raising a number of questions in turn. If public money is being spent on soil, does that make the soil itself a public asset? Is the priority for any given soil to deliver productivity or ecosystem results? When payments take place, should they be for outcomes or for practices? And which outcomes should be the priority? Improved structure, carbon storage, or biodiversity? And finally, how should all this be measured? Which of the raft of new and old technologies available should a farmer choose, and how much should they spend on them? So a number of questions about soil at a time when there is already a huge amount of uncertainty for farmers. And this is the context into which the SHAPE will be launched or announced later on this year. I think if we were to condense our expectation of SHAPE into one soundbite, it would be the following: to harness this once in a generation momentum behind soil, but also provide clarity and consistency and common purpose needed to deliver real change. And what does this mean in practice? So to kick off the conversation, we pulled together a short shopping list of possible areas of government intervention, organized according to what we see as the 4 drivers of soil health: education, regulation, incentivization, and measurement. So starting with education and knowledge, the message we hear from farmers time and time again is that it's peer-to-peer learning, such as the presentations we've just seen at events like Groundswell that Rebecca referred to earlier, that are the most effective driver of change. And a priority for SHAPE must be to explore ways of unlocking this expertise and driving best practice throughout the industry into universal practice. In parallel, we see a clear need to review where soil sits within the professional farming curriculum to ensure it reflects the latest scientific and policy developments, as well as higher and continued education, and most importantly, the independent advisory services. And finally, we see that there is considerable investment needed in areas where there are the greatest knowledge gaps, emerging and neglected issues where the science is weakest. These would include soil biodiversity, microplastics, urban soils, and the connection between soil health and human health, to name just a few. So the next point is regulation, and it's challenging to talk about the role of regulation at any time, but especially now when there is so much of the regulation that relates to soil is up in the air. The awareness of the 8 farming rules for water is still relatively low. Cross-compliance for protection for soil is falling away, and the sustainable farming incentive is coming into force. That being said, however, the state of limbo is not going to last forever, and we're very keen that SHAPE lays the foundations for a robust but proportionate regulatory framework around soil for when the post-Brexit dust has settled. This might include focusing on those practices that cause the most damage by tightening up the language of the farming rules, replacing terms like reasonable precautions, which is open to interpretation, with something a lot clearer and a lot more specific. And a good example of that is the banning of maize on slopes, which has already come up in the chat. We'd also like to see the SHAPE consider minimum soil organic matter thresholds tailored to specific soil and farming types. Thresholds that should at the very least trigger advice and guidance, if not necessarily penalties for those that fall below them. And then finally, we'd like to see a new instrument, a general binding rules for soil health, if you like, to reflect the fact that A, not all soil erosion is water related, and B, that not all soils are to be found in an agricultural setting, something that would pave the way to a stricter framework for urban and contaminated soils. On to incentivization. As I explained earlier, a farm soil carbon marketplace is emerging, and one that combines public and private sector incomes. Now, as with any marketplace, we see a role for the government in ensuring transparency, credibility, and high standards. And a marketplace will enable, in particular, confident decision-making by farmers about which schemes to choose and the economic and environmental benefits that will follow. To achieve this, we'd like to see, first of all, an ongoing review of the SFI payment rates for soil to ensure they deliver value for money for both the farmer and the taxpayer, as well as to achieve close alignment with the private market and not squeeze it out, as well as open the door to potentially stacked payments for the different ecosystem services soils will deliver, as was indicated earlier, it's not just about carbon. We'd also like to see a clear message from the government that farmers should only engage in private sector schemes where they have full confidence in the underlying methodology, their responsibilities, and can see total transparency over the claims in the reporting. And then finally, we'd like to see support for a farm soil carbon code to sit alongside those for woodland and peatland, something I have a vested interest in as the programme manager, and which Liz will talk more about later on this afternoon. And then the final point is potentially the most controversial, and that is measurement. Now, the absence of a standardised set of agreed metrics for soil health has been the bugbear of the soils community for a generation and a major roadblock to ambitious joined-up thinking. If we had one demand of Defra, it would be to address this blockage and use SHAPE as a springboard to develop a universal framework around soils measurement. Now, this does not mean a one-size-fits-all model, but we envisage instead potentially a short list of physical, biological, and chemical soils indicators that can then be applied to different contexts and categories: farming, crop, climate, landscape types, etc. Balancing the need for the simplicity with the inherent complexity of soils and the need for flexibility and local adaptability, the kind of adaptability and flexibility that James referred to at the very start, and that Sophie alluded to when she indicated that NPK measurements wouldn't be appropriate for organic soils. We see this framework being then implementable in the form of benchmarks for farmers across the country so that they can know what they can expect from their specific soils, change their management accordingly, and witness change in their individual soils over time. These metrics can then also be rolled out across the different mechanisms: guidance, regulation, education, labeling, data collection, etc., as well as crucially nationwide monitoring. And our final ask is that that be another area that receives adequate investment. I could go on, but in the interest of time, I think I'll leave it there. Today is very much the start of a conversation that will lead up to the announcement of the framework later on the year, and then the consultation around that. Really look forward to hearing your views, so please do get in touch and to any questions now.
Great, thank you, Matthew, and also thank you for that reminder that soils is actually, of course, wider than farming, and someone has also raised in the chat the relationship to the land use planning framework, and you've mentioned the urban context as well. So the shape could potentially be huge, but those are really useful markers there. We thought it would be interesting to get some views through Menti of what people thought might be the major drivers of soil management in the next 5 years. Is it going to be about government incentives or private payments for carbon or wider ecosystem benefits? Or will it come through consumers? Or will it just be that farmers need to reduce their management costs? So there are lots of different potential pressures and drivers for soil. So it'd be interesting to get some views there. This is a quite flashy new Menti that I've not seen before. It's wobbling away there. So looks like interesting that quite a lot of people thinking that the consumer pressure might drive change, and that's a useful lead into our next presentation from Callum Weir from WWF, who some of you might know from his previous guise as the farm manager at the National Trust's organic farm at Wimpole Hall, who's going to talk a little bit more about how the supply chain acts to help or hinder good soil management by farmers. So interesting results of the survey there. You can carry on voting there if you'd like to, but I'll hand over to Callum at this point, who's going to talk about recent WWF work in this sphere. Callum.
Thanks a lot, Gareth. Yeah, I'm Callum Weir, a sustainable agriculture specialist at WWF. And as Gareth said, and very interesting about the poll results, I'm going to be talking about the role that food businesses have in promoting soil health. Next slide, please. So McCain, Pepsi, Tesco, McDonald's, Cargill, everyone's interested in soil. As Matthew said, soil is cool this year, and regenerative agriculture is definitely the buzzword of this conference and of large food businesses. And perhaps this is a good thing. Many listening to this call will know the influence sourcing policies have on the way our food is produced. So a greater focus on soil from large food businesses can only help, right? I don't know. And if we believe regenerative agriculture is the route to addressing large elements of the climate and biodiversity crisis we face, large food businesses can be the route to scale, at least in the short term. Because perhaps the challenge with regenerative agriculture and sustainable food in general is not necessarily the supply, but the demand, and large food businesses could help address that issue. But we all know there are risks. Regenerative agriculture is a fluid concept. It trusts the farmer to make the right decision for their situation, to be flexible, as James said earlier. So there are no hard and fast rules. And in the chat, I'd like to ask people, are practitioners willing to sacrifice some of this flexibility in order to gain perhaps a price premium for regenerative products? So with so many initiatives, policies, activities, it's getting confusing out there. It's getting confusing for farmers, it's getting confusing for food businesses, and it's getting confusing for consumers, particularly when greenwashing remains a constant risk. Is a cover crop subsidy scheme equivalent to a regenerative agriculture sourcing policy? I don't think so. So with all this risk and with all this opportunity, we at WWF wanted to look at some of the policies of large food businesses collectively. Next slide, please. We wanted to find out what are large food businesses doing for soil health. Where does sustainable agriculture fit within the corporate strategies of these businesses? How useful are regenerative agriculture sourcing policies? And what does best practice look like for all these kind of policies? Ultimately, we wanted to understand, are these policies of large food businesses impactful? And we want to know what we can do to improve the influence large food businesses have on soil health. So to achieve this, we commissioned the Tesco and WWF partnership, commissioned the Sustainable Soil Alliance to answer some of these questions. Matt on this call and Ellie and Anise from SSA led the research. And a few weeks ago, we launched the report on World Soils Day. Next slide, please. So what did we find out in this report? Well, in the sourcing policies, there's a lot of them. But when considered collectively, the culmination of all these initiatives of the 25 food businesses that we looked at, the culmination was less than the sum of the individual parts. There was also a worrying lack of the understanding amongst food businesses of how sourcing policies could in fact cause harm to soil. Safeguards to prevent soil degradation, such as preventing harvesting in bad conditions, were largely non-existent. And a key consequence of this finding is that too often farmers are positioned between a rock and a hard place. In certain circumstances, farmers are required to choose between complying with their contract and complying with agricultural regulation or the law. In combination, this leads to a contradiction. Food businesses can be doing good projects which are simultaneously undermined by bad policies. Food businesses must focus on the anti-negative as much as the positive. And if we go up into the corporate strategies of these large food businesses, at least 20 of them refer to some form of sustainable agriculture phrasing within these strategies. So clearly, it must be considered strategically important. But often, existing projects are retrofitted into recently developed sustainability strategies to make a food business look like they've been working on soil for decades. And when this happens, projects rarely ladder up effectively to deliver an end goal. And in a case where top-down approaches do work, I think companies are better taking a top-down approach and setting a strategy before developing the work streams that deliver it. And another interesting finding is that many food businesses find engagement with consumers on soil health potentially difficult. Their reflections were that consumers expect farmers to already look after their soil health. And do they have a point? With regenerative agriculture specifically, the term is becoming increasingly popular. However, the definition remains unclear and inconsistent. In particular, phrases of regenerative agriculture and agroecology seem to be used interchangeably, and ultimately this could undermine both philosophies. Equally, there was very limited appetite from large food businesses to create a regenerative agriculture certification scheme, because there was a concern that such definitions could stifle what is an innovative and ultimately ground-up initiative. That said, there was a definite interest in, There's a definite interest in the use of soil carbon as part of net zero strategies, but there are currently too many gaps in the science for it to be currently a feature. But as recently demonstrated research by WWF shows, food businesses do have a unique ability to be able to reward and share the benefit of the carbon sequestered on farms. Next slide, please. So what next? Large food businesses have considerable power in defining the food we consume and how it is produced. They are the focus point of our hourglass-shaped supply chain. In recognition of this, WWF have created the basket metric. It is an exciting tool we'll be using to hold the whole food retail sector to account for its impact on climate and nature. And at COP26, we were delighted to announce that our partners Tesco and M&S, alongside Co-op, Sainsbury's and Waitrose, signed up to our commitment to halve the environmental impact of the average shopping basket by 2030. Next slide, please. We're also going to be working to support Sustainable Soil Alliance to deliver the brilliant recommendations of the Soils and the Supply Chain report. In particular, the creation of SHIP, Soil Health Industry Platform, not Soil Health Industry Task Force, will help galvanize efforts on soil health. Another platform, many of you will be asking, will it be useful? I do think so. The rationale for greater collaboration between businesses that depend on soil for the products that they sell couldn't be more clear. Soil improvement is incremental, it's non-excludable, and it's reversible. The benefits are spread between farmers, landowners, retailers, manufacturers, and the environment in general. While on the flip side, decades of good work can be undone by bad actions in a very short space of time. Only through collaboration and cooperation can we achieve the results needed for soil and for agriculture to contribute to critical net zero and nature targets. Thank you very much.
Callum, thank you for that really interesting presentation and what's a very interesting piece of work that you've undertaken with Sustainable Soils Alliance there. We thought we'd ask a little mischievous question in light of Callum's presentation about what's the barrier at the moment? What's stopping everything being perfect in soil management? Is it about us as consumers and citizens, or is it that farmers are doing the wrong thing? So interesting to, very interesting results here. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, Callum.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think that that consumers maybe they are interested in paying for things, but I think it's got to be clear that where that investment's going. I think it's not simply a question of increasing the price necessarily means that farming will necessarily be more sustainable. It's got to, that investment's got to be directed in the right initiatives.
Yeah. Well, and thank you very much for pointing out that it's so multifaceted. It's not just about regulation or incentives or government action. There's the food supply chain is a critical influence on what farmers do and can sometimes be more significant than the regulatory and government framework. And that takes us to our final presentation from my colleague Liz Bowles at the Soil Association, who's an assistant director at the Soil Association, who's going to pick up from where Callum left off there and talk more about the soil carbon code and about some of the potential market issues around soil and soil carbon. So Liz, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Gareth, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll just wait for my first slide to come up. But what I would say is I'd really suggest to everybody to read the report which Callum cited, because I think it really sets out so well the conflict between what food businesses would like their farmers to be doing and the realities about what they require every day in order to keep shelves stocked. And I think it's that bit where we've really got to do some work to manage that conflict. So I'm just going to really cover off this whole area of soil carbon and hopefully answer some of the questions that you may have about it and demystify some of the myths about this voluntary evolving market. And it has been around for more than 20 years, but over the last, I suppose, 12 to 18 months, that interest has really skyrocketed. And it's very much because of the increasing focus on the net zero requirements for all businesses. So many organisations at the moment are making commitments about net zero. They're saying they want to get to net zero and they're looking to see how best they can do that. But all these net zero strategies, most of them still plan to carry on emitting carbon and simply pay somebody else to do some offsets to help them look better on paper. I think it's really important to know that the carbon offsets do not reduce the overall emissions, but they simply reward a third party for doing something which increases carbon storage permanently elsewhere. And I just wanted to say that the Soil Association is already involved in this voluntary market through our accreditation under the Woodland Carbon Code and our support for developing standards for the Farmland Soil Carbon Code, which Matt mentioned a moment ago, and also through the Soil Association Exchange Initiative, which we're developing to secure fair rewards for land managers from these private markets. So what I'm going to cover off very briefly in my 7 minutes is, firstly, the kind of things which can sequester carbon, because I think very often there's some sort of misunderstanding about that. And then secondly, looking at the features this market needs, and very briefly touch on the carbon code, and then look at the challenges in this current marketplace and some pointers for farmers. So next slide, please, Anna. And this slide, and in a way, it feels a little bit as if this slide just sets out all the different elements that are required if we're going to develop a properly functioning market for carbon from farmed land. And at the moment, most of these things simply don't exist. And for instance, on monitoring and verification, we still don't really have an agreed way to carry out soil analysis, although I would say that the Farm Carbon Toolkit has made a really good start in their guidance on how best farmers should be taking soil samples and getting them analysed. And it is something I think that for all farmers to be thinking about baselining their soils wouldn't be a bad idea, so that you know where you stand. But I think it's also worth mentioning that within this market for carbon offsets, it's all about permanently either sequestering carbon or reducing emissions. And there's been an awful lot of interest amongst farmers on permanent pastures who feel they've already done a brilliant job in sequestering carbon. And indeed they have, but in terms of this particular market where other businesses want to reduce their balance sheet on emissions, it simply won't help them to team up with farmers who've already essentially sequestered most of the carbon they're going to be able to sequester. Although having said that, I think there will be more opportunities where businesses simply want to team up with farmers who are doing the right thing, but don't require the transfer of those carbon offsets to their balance sheet. So next slide, please, Anna. Now this slide, I appreciate you won't be able to read it, at least I don't imagine you better read it. And I have to say, Callum, I've shamelessly taken this from the Green Alliance report because I thought it was helpful. And please don't think you need to remember any of these numbers. But what this report did was it sort of itemised the kind of measures that farmers can do whilst farming to sequester carbon. And you don't need to remember the absolute numbers, but perhaps just look at the difference in size. And you can see right at the top the kind of contributions from building biomass in trees and hedges far outstrips anything you can do as a farmer to incorporate organic matter or move to no-till systems. And all of these are dwarfed by the potential impact of reducing emissions on arable land on peat through reducing the drainage depth. And I put this up here really just to make it clear that when we're talking about all this sort of interest in selling carbon offsets, we need to think about actually how big are they and the kind of value that's being talked about. And really, you know, is this something that as a farmer you would want to be doing, especially if going forward your main customer for food is going to require you to be able to demonstrate your bona fides within this space. So again, this hopefully just gives you an indicator of where the best ways are to be able to sequester carbon. Next slide, please. And I think this is the sort of slide that I'd like to focus on most, because it just demonstrates the kind of features that are needed. So the sequestered carbon needs to be real, and it needs, and I think coupled with that is the permanence. And although some people are talking about a 10-year period, in my dictionary, permanent means forever. But certainly it needs to be something that if somebody wants to transfer your farm's carbon to their balance sheet, they want to know that it's there at the end of the term. And if it's not there, then potentially you as the farmer will have to recompense the buyer. And then the second point here is about verifiability, and that goes back to that Venn diagram I shared with you. And at the moment, the Soil Carbon Code development is working out how that can be done consistently and in a way that everybody agrees is the right way to do it. And this next point about it needing to be additional, really important. It must be over and above what would have occurred anyway under business as usual conditions. And that can be quite tricky for a farmer who's trying out new farming practices. It's fine if the person wanting to pay you for doing it doesn't need to have those credits transferred to their balance sheet, if they simply want to pay you for doing the right thing, but that's slightly different. And certainly the thing that's really starting to make everybody scratch their heads is this issue of no double counting. And certainly if you think about it, if most of the businesses that buy from you as farmers will want in the future only to buy from farms who are on that journey towards net zero, if you've sold carbon offsets elsewhere, you've effectively become a high carbon producer. So that's something that I think all farmers must really think about very carefully. And obviously sort of no leakage, no consequences elsewhere within the chain. And the issue of fairness is really important, because at the moment, farm businesses are, it's a little bit, it is, and everybody says it's a bit of a Wild West out there. And I think this is something where it is getting a bit more regulated, and it's slides that I haven't shared with you today, but increasingly there are more websites you can go to actually check out the scheme that you're thinking you might get involved with, to see how well they score against these requirements. Next slide, please, Anna. Yeah, this is just to reiterate the need for a carbon code. So as Matthew stated, work's been going on now, I think for about 6 months. I may be wrong, but it's really a combined effort of so many different organisations to develop this code to provide market confidence, both for investors and for farmers. And at the moment, it's being developed by a team of advisors and academics. But I do know that there's great efforts being made to bring Defra into this conversation, because clearly there's a need to have government bought into this kind of farm and carbon code, if indeed it is to take off across the UK. But interestingly, even since July, I would say that some of these sentiments are changing slightly away from thinking it's the way to go towards thinking that possibly for farmers, the price for the carbon needs to be really high enough to make it worthwhile to hand over control for your business operation to that business that's buying your carbon, because effectively that can be what you're doing if the carbon is being transferred to somebody else's balance sheet. And you can see that within this code, the 3 elements is reviewing international soil carbon standards, and then this review of on-farm soil carbon interventions, which actually the report from Green Alliance is really contributing well to, as well as the work that's being done through many research projects to identify how best to carry out this soil analysis in a consistent fashion, as well as looking at the interest amongst farmers and investors to establish those perspectives. Next slide, please, Anna. Yeah, and I would say at the moment, I'm just left wondering if there's a better way, because the current prices for carbon aren't particularly high, for tying the farmer's hands. That's the point, really. And that whether they represent true additionality, and as I said earlier, it needs to be the farmer doing something different and additional to what they would do normally. And I think this issue of transaction costs, because bear in mind, either the carbon will be measured remotely, but that relies on fairly non-granular data, so it's not that accurate for your fields, or it requires fairly intensive soil testing, which at the moment is very expensive. That's what I mean by transaction costs. It's not for nothing being paid for the soil carbon. So, you know, whether we're actually better looking to support farmers to reduce their own emissions and keep their carbon because they're going to need it, rather than selling it to others, is a real live question in my mind. Next slide, please. And this really is the final slide, and it's these watch outs for you as farmers. So I think I've covered it, but if you're going to sell carbon offsets, what does that mean you can then say about your carbon footprint? Because effectively your carbon will transfer to somebody else's balance sheet, leaving you potentially as a high carbon producer. And then I think, as I mentioned earlier, look at the scheme really closely. Is it robust? What does it say about permanence, additionality, measurement and verification? And can you really say that you will be able to deliver those changes over the period of time that the offset requires? And I think even the final one there is actually, as a farmer, I would say, and certainly I would say that as a farmer myself, I'd actually want to know who was buying it, and did I really approve of them buying carbon offsets from me? Because effectively that could affect your reputation as a farmer. So that's really, hopefully that's given you some thoughts in terms of demystifying this fast evolving market. I think that's the last slide, Anna. I think we're on to the mentoring.
Liz, thank you very much. Yeah, some really knotty issues there. And we all want to valorize soils, but do we want to put a price on them? That's a really tricky question, isn't it? And interesting looking at the work that's going on. In light of that, our final question through Menti was around soil carbon markets. What do people think about whether they can be made to work, or indeed whether they should be made to work? So if you've got any thoughts on that, do log on to Menti and give your answer. And we've actually got a little bit of time left for questions, and I'll start straight off with a question that came in for you there, Liz. Was a question from Mandy Stoker that with a fear that the financial incentives and focus on carbon could lead to unintended consequences and bad practice. What do you think that's the case? And if so, how might we avoid those?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly I do think that we need to be very careful within this market. Mainly, I think it's the farmers that need to be really careful to make sure that they're not selling something which they really need, or are committing themselves effectively not to be able to farm, because that's what some of these offsets might end up requiring them to do. And so perhaps that is the unintended consequences that the questioner refers to, because certainly I've heard of instances where that almost is the case. And you know, you'll end up with this lengthy agreement that you have to sign up to, which when you get to read the small print, it can effectively tie your hands. And if the payment is relatively low, then you need to think very carefully about whether the payment is worthwhile for the loss of control.
Great, thanks. If the panel would like to make themselves visible again, I'll just take some of the questions that have come through and have been upvoted here. One from Sarah Watkinson. Will SHAPE standards include microbiology for this, or should they include microbiology of the soil? Which is an interesting question. I certainly recall, and there was an interesting comment in the chat that too many people see soil as dirt. And I recall from the days of biodiversity action plans, there were plans for woods and there were plans for meadows. There was never a plan for soil. And it was always, I mean, it's probably the most biodiverse habitat that we've got in the UK. And for too long, it's been neglected, not just by farmers, it's too easy to point just at farmers, by environmentalists, ecologists, and all of us as well. So should and how should standards reflect the microbiology as well as soil structure? Any thoughts on that, Matthew?
And the short answer to that is yes. I mean, interestingly, soil is the missing piece of the biodiversity picture, and biodiversity is a missing piece of the soils picture when it comes to research. So it's an area where a huge amount of research is needed, but no, we'd certainly like to see it included within.
It has to be, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Sophie.
Yes, obviously, I think microbiology in soils is absolutely central, but I wouldn't like anyone who manages to farm well on sandy soil or other types of soil that, you know, have very little microbiology. So it's they mustn't be persecuted for type of their soils. I think that's really important. Not all soils are equal.
Yeah, back to that problem of how to create universal standards and metrics for such a heterogeneous medium as soil. But by the way, if any of the Defra people on the call want to contribute, I'm not sure if you can signal, or we'll try and unmute you, but if you do want to contribute on any of this, please attempt to do so. Liz, have you got to?
Yeah, just about this microbiology, it wouldn't be top of my list to measure it, simply for two reasons. And actually, we learned a lot about this doing the compost tea field lab with Sophie a few years ago, that the actual populations of microbiota is hugely variable depending on soil temperature and time of year. But I think there's a real benefit to be gained from looking at levels of compaction and soil water infiltration, alongside perhaps looking at earthworms, although I do appreciate that on sandy soils you're never going to find as many earthworms as on clay soils. So I think there's a real sort of need to be clear about the variability depending on soil type.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Rachel, if we can unmute Rachel, is that possible, Alex?
Yeah, Rachel can talk.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, just to respond to that question, firstly, just to say that thank you to everyone's presentations and comments. It's been incredibly useful to hear today.
And I should say Rachel is actually from the Defra team, so great to have you with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Gareth. Yes, I head up the soil policy team. Just to say that with the soil health action plan for England, just to make it absolutely clear, these aren't standards. This is our hybrid sort of strategy and action plan all in one. So we're hoping for it to be as strategic as possible in that respect. And we absolutely will be including biodiversity issues in here completely. We can't, you know, as I think it was Matthew that just said, you know, it is a missing piece of the puzzle generally. And there's a lot of interest in this across Defra.
That's really encouraging to know, because I think particularly coming from the sort of organic agroecological end of the spectrum, the recognition that soil's a living thing rather than just a substrate is really important, I think. So that's really encouraging to hear. But as Liz said, the challenge will be to think about how that can be reflected in national policy. Really interesting to hear that. Thanks for that, Rachel. And just maybe move on to another question here from Christopher Stopes, who I imagine is Christopher Stopes from the English Organic Forum, who I know well. Yes, well, if recognition is so widespread amongst farmers and indeed others, how come soils are in such a bad state and biodiversity depleted? I mean, it's an interesting question. And I have to say, every time I tuck into a packet of crisps, which I try not to do, I think about, you know, going through Herefordshire and looking at the soil on the roads. It's really difficult to grow some things without impacting negatively on soils. And we know that there's some soil management practice isn't good. And someone raised also the issue of maize cultivation as well, which I see in Wiltshire. I mean, maize harvesting late in the year. So why this dichotomy between us knowing we need to do something and it being so difficult to actually move forward on this agenda? Do any of the farmers on the panel have any views on that? Adrian?
Yeah, I think it's possible for farmers to be a bit stuck in the supply chain that they're in. I think the specialisation, the investment required to supply supermarkets with cold stores, pack houses, all the rest of it, and the the sort of fewer opportunities and outlets to sell through and being bound to sort of contracts can lead to some real conflicts, really. I think Callum sort of mentioned that, and Matthew, I think, as well. So I think that being told to wait to lift your potatoes until the pack house has finished processing their Belgian potatoes, for instance, which happened to me 25 years ago, that was, as far as I'm concerned, that was the last time I ever dealt with a supermarket, because we had to then, do make some real difficult decisions when we did come to lift because the weather had broken.
Really interesting. So that point from Callum about the supply chain being absolutely key here, and having a collaborative approach, and not just a bit of sort of nice rhetoric, is key, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's a lack, people are kind of bound in to a certain extent. Which is why I talk about the need for a real transition in the food system to make this work.
Great, thank you for that. Sophie, I think you had something as well on that.
Yes, very related to what Adrian was saying, but it is also the balance of power. Farmers are locked into huge capital costs, and yet their return on capital invested is probably the smallest in the food chain. So your options to change your system are really curtailed.
Great, thank you for that. Callum.
It was just to say that why is the issue? I think it's because the incentives and the consequences of incentives of good practice and consequences of bad practice aren't quite aligned. But I think with soil going up the radar, that will change. But an interesting point on the research that SSA undertook for us was that supermarkets and retailers, they don't want to tell farmers how to farm. They don't want to be too prescriptive. So I think it's really important that the private market is quite good at incentivizing good practice, but it's not very good at stopping bad practice. And that's where regulation and proper enforcement of the regulatory bodies, and talking to Rachel here and others, it is crucial, and it was good to see that the Environment Agency being their resources being bolstered to try and address some of the bad practice. And a personal thing is that I think it shouldn't just be the farmer at fault when the EA comes along and sees some bad practice. The EA should go further, understanding who was the private market, who was the person buying the potatoes that caused the soil to leave. It's not just the farmer, it's the whole supply chain that needs to be culpable for the bad practice.
Interesting. Liz, you're going to have the last brief comment, and then I'm going to have to wind before we're cut off.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. So yeah, my comment was going to be this. I think that the other factor that's really prevalent within this is just how much more variable weather has become, which makes it much more difficult for farmers. They think they're doing the right thing, but an inch of rain in half an hour later, they clearly weren't doing the right thing. And I think certainly I'd agree with Callum that the Environment Agency and Defra are looking at how they can do more to really support farmers to think about how they need to manage soils in the future, because I think probably we've got to do it differently.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to all of the panelists. It was a really interesting discussion. Thank you also to the Minister for providing that clip to start us off. And I noticed that Defra have posted, if you want to communicate directly with Defra, we will pass on a lot of this to Defra, but the mailbox soilhealth@defra.gov.uk, and particularly if you're in England, they're keen to hear from you. So a lot of the interesting stuff we've seen in the chat today, if you want to get in touch with Defra, that link is there. Thank you very much to you for attending the session. Really interesting stuff going on in the chat and in the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. And also thank you very much to our ORFC hosts who worked incredibly hard to get this conference online at very short notice. And it's a lot less fun for them doing that behind the scenes and not being able to see us in person. Let's hope we can all meet together next year. And there are also ORFC events through the year as well. I went to a really good one at Wakelands this year. Last year, so keep your eye out for events out in the field this year, we will pass some of the discussion on to Defra that we've had today. Thanks very much for your participation, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you and goodbye.